So, if we could give Dr. Kalashewski welcome.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. I want to thank Dr. Vargo and Dr. Connors for giving me the opportunity to talk with you today. I'm going to play a little bit off that whole track thing, community college student. Hopefully you don't take this track. Alpena Community College, I was on academic probation for a year or two. And then when then many years later, when I sort of figured it out, I was awarded their Distinguished Alumni Award in 2004. And my opening was, isn't this great? The institution that put me on academic probation is now awarding me as one of their distinguished alumni. So I hope you don't follow that track. So if you're a little confused in life, it could straighten out for you. What we're going to talk about today is forensic psychology. Dr. Connors gave a little bit of my background, and I'm actually just 2 blocks down the street here. So it's kind of nice that you've got someone in town who can talk a little bit about this. We're going to focus on the real world of forensic psychology, and I hope it's not too disappointing. I'm not riding around in the back of squad cars with a gun trying to track down serial killers. I've seen many serial killers over the years. We can talk a little bit about that. What I think I'm going to do today in the presentation is I'm going to talk a little bit about forensic psychology in general, try to give you a taste of how broad the field is and what's involved in the field. And then I'm going to highlight a few things that as a working forensic psychologist I deal with on a daily basis. Some of these things I'm sure you've heard of in the media. Insanity, competency to stand trial, things like that. We'll get into a couple of other issues or a couple of other tasks that I do as a working forensic psychologist that have to do with family law. If 2 people are going through a divorce and they're fighting over custody, sometimes the judge sends them to me to do a custody evaluation. I'll talk a little bit about that. I'm planning on talking for about an hour. I've got a lot of slides. I don't know if I'll get through all of them. We'll kind of see where it goes. And then I think the way that this was designed was I'd sort of do the presentation for the first hour or so and then just field questions. And then I can just, I like that it was designed that way because in my opinion, when I do talks like this, one of the things that I think people get the most out of is when you put the curriculum down and you start having discussions and asking questions. So where we'll start out today is I'm going to put up a very, very simple definition of forensic psychology. You'll find out it's not such a simple area or field, but the definition is really simple. Application of psychological science within the legal system. A little bit on the history of forensic psychology, or basically psychologists in court. It's been an interesting history. There's a guy named Hugo Munsterberg. Isn't that a great name? Hugo Munsterberg. 1908, wrote On the Witness Stand. And Hugo, I should name, if I have any more kids, I should name him Hugo. Talks about all kinds of fun stuff. You know, back in these days, 100 years ago, when you were a psychology professor, you could just make up stuff and write about it. And people would try to go out and prove it wrong. Well, Hugo stepped onto some interesting ideas. Untrue confessions is one of his chapters. Why would people go make a confession when they didn't do it? Have you ever heard of this topic in the media at all? It's called false confessions now. Hugo got onto that. He also, hypnotism and crime. Anyone hear of famous cases, well, about 20 years ago now, where children would be hypnotized and would allegedly tell therapists and police that they were sexually abused in their daycare? Have you heard about these? I mean, they were quite spectacular cases 20 years ago. Well, Hugo talks a little bit about that. So Hugo was kind of the first forensic psychologist. But after he got started, throughout the years and throughout the century, psychologists have sort of been in and out of court. Social workers had a much more strong presence in court up until probably the 1960s. And then you would get psychologists in and out, but there was no real forensic training programs. The 70s, things started to get really interesting with the psychologists because insanity defenses came up. You've all heard of that, right? some famous cases. Harvey Milk, that Harvey Milk movie. I haven't seen that yet. I heard it's good, though. I think they did an insanity defense. They called it the Twinkie defense. We'll talk a little bit about that stuff. So psychologists, one of my colleagues who started our firm in 1972, Don Van Ostenburg, said when he landed in town, psychologists weren't allowed in the courts in Grand Rapids. In the 80s, he started breaking into that. And now we're an integral part of a lot of court decisions within specific types of problems. So we'll get into more of that. So that is a real basic definition. Other examples of forensic pathology. Anybody remember Quincy? Quincy, yeah, just the folks that aren't super young. Quincy was a forensic pathologist. He was an MD medical doctor, right? Autopsies, cause of death, we all know about that stuff. Forensic science, that's the stuff that all the TV shows have, right? Blood splatter analysis and things like that. Forensic dentistry, do you ever hear that? Trying to identify a body by bite marks, right? Or bite marks in crimes. Forensic accounting, that's when you are arrested for fraud and the feds hire a forensic accountant to go in and look at the way you're keeping your books. So all of these, so this would be accounting intertwined with the legal system, dentistry intertwined with the legal system. Oh, by the way, I forgot to give you my little warning. I deal with really kind of nasty people and nasty scenarios all day long. So I always have to kind of filter myself that I may give some examples today, and I don't mean to offend people or give you disturbing stories, but I talk about this stuff every day, so sometimes I might be a little blunt and abrasive, and I apologize ahead of time. Wow, look at that. The broad area of forensic psychology. These are things that a forensic psychologist may have to deal with on a daily basis. Insanity evaluations, criminal responsibility, we're going to highlight those. Look, juvenile competency to stand trial. I'll talk more about that. Guardianship. Do you need a guardian? A forensic psychologist sometimes has to get involved. Police psychology, expert testimony. I testify a lot in court. Risk for sexual offending, disability, civil litigation. You know what that means? If someone runs into your car and you sue them and you say that you have emotional distress and psychological damage, you might need a forensic psychologist to get involved. I do some of this. I tend to work more for the defense. I'm not very good at kind of crafting an opinion to make an attorney happy. I hope that... Yeah, actually, someone sued Toyota, and I got hired on that case. Interesting. American with Disabilities Act. If you have a disability and you need special accommodations, or if you get fired and you say it was because of your disability, I've had cases like that. Fitness to carry a firearm. That's an interesting one. If you've been hospitalized for psychiatric reasons and then you want a concealed weapons permit. Let's see. What other? False confessions, I already mentioned that. Trial consultation, I'll talk about that. That's really interesting. Victim psychology. We'll talk about correctional psychology. I was a prison psychologist for 7 years. Here's a good one. The psychology of lawyers. That's my new area I'm kind of getting into. There's a great book on Know Thyself Lawyer or something like that I have to order. And how do you train lawyers to go into court and do a good job? That's really fun. Okay. So just remember, the whole definition is, right, application of psychological science within the legal system. All right. The roles of a forensic psychologist. Clinician. Most forensic psychologists spend most of their time doing this. In other words, they examine people, they look at people, they evaluate people, they write reports about people. I'll skip down to treater. Treater is a very specific type of work. If someone's found not competent to stand trial, and you'll know what that means when we leave today. Sometimes you have to treat them until they become competent. And then a consultant. That's stuff that's all over the place. Interviewing witnesses, strategizing, helping attorneys develop a cross-examination of a expert witness psychologist. Jury selection, we'll talk about that, right? You've heard of that before? That's really got some press. Okay. I'm going to go through this quick because I want to get to the good stuff. Application of forensic psychology. This is to within criminal proceedings. You can do a pretrial application of forensic psychology, competent to stand trial. If you're not competent to stand trial, they can't take you to court. In trial, I'll get asked to provide a conceptualization of why a person would do this kind of behavior. Sentencing, that mostly is for federal law, where you can go underneath the guidelines of sentencing or over the guidelines of sentencing based on sort of knowing the psychology of the person. And appeals, I'm doing more of that where cases will come up for appeal. Civil litigation I talked about, family court I talked about, probate court are things like guardianship, competency to make decisions about your medical care, stuff like that. All right. The one thing that you have to understand about what a forensic psychologist does is applies principles of psychology to a particular legal statute. So what a psychologist, a well-trained forensic psychologist does is they go through a training program where they become sort of amateur lawyers. When I went through my training, I had to read lots of case law. You know, anybody who's in law school or is a lawyer, they talk about case law. You have to read all that. And what you have to do is you have to learn how to interpret statute to a certain degree. Now, a judge interprets statute, right? But you have to, as a forensic psychologist, understand what you're looking at and what questions you're trying to answer for the court. Criminal proceedings. The pretrial criminal responsibility. Let's jump to that guy. Whoa, what is that? MCL, section 76121A1. This is the statute in Michigan for criminal responsibility. If, as a result of a mental illness or mental retardation, as defined in MCL, blah, 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 that person lacks substantial capacity either to appreciate the nature and quality or the wrongfulness of his or her conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law. What does that mean? Basically what it means is if someone has done a crime, do they have a mental problem that would make it so they would not understand the nature and quality or wrongfulness of their conduct or be able to control their conduct to the requirements of the law? This is state law. Federal law is called insanity. It used to be called insanity in Michigan, but they changed it to criminal responsibility. I guess that's a more politically correct term, I guess. If you read this, it's similar. The criminal defense asserting that at the time of the commission of the acts constituting the offense, the defendant, as a result of severe mental disease or defect, I love that severe, that's a good thing to put in there, was unable to appreciate the nature and quality or the wrongfulness of his acts. Okay? Basically, it says about the same thing. So as a forensic psychologist, what will happen is you will get asked to answer the question of insanity or criminal responsibility. So I have to do an evaluation and make an opinion whether or not this person appreciated the nature and quality and wrongfulness of their conduct or could conform their conduct to the requirements of the law. If you are found, and if this goes to court and becomes a big trial, you can be found not guilty by reason of insanity or not guilty due to a lack of criminal responsibility. You've heard about these cases before, right? Insanity cases. How often does it work? Does anybody know? Want to take a guess? Go ahead.
About 1 out of 100 times.
Anybody else have any ideas? What's that? You guys are great. Yeah, less than 1%. In 1998, they did a big study, and 37% of the public thought, was it 98, 99? And the study said that most people thought 37% of the time it worked. So this is a hard thing to pull off. What makes this difficult to assess as a forensic psychologist is if someone committed a crime on May 14th at 2:30 in the morning, 2009, and now I see them on December 10th. I have to try to get some understanding of their state of mind at the time of the alleged crime. That's the tough part of applying the statute. There are a lot of famous cases that went nowhere with this. Jack Ruby, you guys know who he is, right? He shot Kennedy. They went for an insanity defense. Sirhan shot Bobby Kennedy. They went for an insanity defense. John Wayne Gacy, you remember him? He was a guy in Chicago who dressed up as a clown and had 33 bodies underneath his house. He tried, didn't work. Jeffrey Dahmer went for this, didn't work. So you guys are a smarter crowd than our general American public, I can tell. You understand that this is something that does not happen very often. It may be asserted from time to time, so it's really not a legal loophole, okay? Let me give you an example of cases I've had where the person was insane and the person wasn't. I'll give you ones where they were insane. When I was in the Federal Bureau of Prisons, we had a guy who walked up to he was mentally ill, got out of the psychiatric hospital, and an hour later went to the bank and said, "You SOBs, give me all my money or I'm blowing this bank up. Give me my money." They hand him a bag of money. He walks across the street to McDonald's, gets a couple of Egg McMuffins, goes out and sits on the picnic table in front, puts the bag of money, he walks to McDonald's, puts a bag of money right on the counter, pulls a couple of dollars out of there, goes, sits on the picnic table in the front of the restaurant, puts his bag of money, and starts to eat his Egg McMuffins when the cops show up. Okay. This guy obviously didn't have a good understanding of the nature and quality and wrongfulness of going into a bank and demanding money or to be blown up. Obviously didn't, because he even tried to get away. Okay. A local case, and I'm not violating confidentiality because this is something that was in the court proceedings. Have you heard about the local case where there was a federal agent who was stealing identities? It's a few years ago. I had to examine her and went into court on that. And she is a federal agent and would walk up with a stolen ATM card that she took out of someone's mail to an ATM with the camera there, put it in and get $20. So obviously, understanding the nature and quality and wrongfulness of her conduct wasn't operating on that particular instance because look at the high probability of being caught. But she just didn't get it. Now, what if you get drunk and you black out? Right? I don't remember. Voluntary intoxication basically takes this off the table. If you get really wasted and do something really bad and don't remember it, you're not going to be able to apply this. That one stuck around a long time in Canada, but I think they got rid of it about 10 years ago. If you have a physician prescribing you medications, and they're prescribing you medications that are way beyond what you should be getting, this will apply. The federal agent I spoke about, and this is all in the court record, and actually it was all in the media too, was on a ton of pain medications and really did not know right from wrong. Okay. Any quick questions on this one? Okay. I don't know how much people know about this, but that's kind of the gist. And so I will get these questions from time to time. The Forensic Center in Ann Arbor does most of these for the state, but I'll get as a second opinion or some federal stuff I get directly from the feds because they found out I was in town. They called me up one day, "Hey, didn't you used to work for us?" I said, "Yeah." And they said, "Can we send people to you instead of North Carolina?" So I did some of those. Competency to stand trial. Yeah.
Question on that last one.
Yeah.
How does a plea for temporary insanity work?
Yeah, there's
If the drunkenness doesn't work, is it just like with medication then?
temporary insanity and permanent insanity really, it's sort of a moot point. They used to talk about temporary insanity, but now it's just insanity. Because what we're talking about is at the time, your mental state. So I suppose someone could be insane for a long period of time, but they used to have that delineation, but they don't really anymore. Because you just focus on the specific incident. Competency to stand trial. I'll run through this quick. A defendant to a criminal charge shall be presumed competent to stand trial. He shall be determined incompetent to stand trial only if he is incapable because of his or her mental condition or understanding the nature and object, blah, 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 of the proceedings against him or of assisting in his defense in a rational manner. So what competency really talks to, this is pre-trial. You go in, and if they allege you're not competent to stand trial, that means you would not be able to understand the nature and object of the proceedings, and you wouldn't be able to help assist your defense. And it has to be because of a mental disease or defect. You need to have a serious mental illness, or mental retardation fits this too. I do a lot more of this type of work. If you're found not competent to stand trial, they can't charge you with a criminal. They can't charge you criminally. So if you find someone not competent, what you also have to do as the forensic psychologist is try to determine and provide an opinion about the chances of them being restored to competency within 15 months. So if someone is really mentally ill and you get them on the right medications, would they be able to meet this standard? And then it's called a competency restoration. If a person has an IQ of 68, which means they're mentally retarded, can you teach them enough about what happens in court through an educational program? Competency restoration. There are 2 states in the country that have extensive, great competency restoration programs. I mean, well-funded. You go live there for 9 months. You go to class every day. Do you want to bet? You want to guess what 2 states have that? You guys want to bet? I'll tell you one, Texas. You know what the other one is? Florida, right. You know why? You got to have someone competent before you can put them to death. So if you have a death penalty, you better have a good competency restoration program. That's interesting, isn't it? So, one thing that I'll do in this area that gets to be very, very, very complicated is juvenile competency. You're 14, you have an IQ of 72, and you sexually molested a 5-year-old. Are you competent to stand trial? Well, we don't have, no states that I'm aware of, well, I shouldn't say that. Most states do not have a specific statute for juvenile competency. So the courts rely on the adult statute. So, if you're 14 and charged with a crime, you have to meet this threshold. I do a lot of those. It's when I first landed here in private practice 8 years ago, and with my background, I had someone call me up and say, geez, I've got this 13-year-old that they're trying to basically put away for 10 years. You know, I don't know if they understand what's going on. So I did some homework and tailored some things and wrote some articles about juvenile competency, and now I get a lot of this kind of work all over the state. And then I testify. This is sort of a local case, a different county, not Kent County. 7-year-old charged with arson 1, arson first degree. You know what the penalty for arson 1 can be? Actually, I think no, that one doesn't go life, but you can get up to 40 years in prison. He was playing with a lighter in the babysitter's trailer and started a closet on fire. So arson 1, so I got the referral, and I looked at the date of birth, and I called the lawyer up. I said, is this date of birth right? He said, yeah. So I said, what are they going to do with the 7-year-old if they convict him? Where are they going to send him for prison? Anyway, I said he wasn't competent. That was sort of a slam dunk. Because then I did his IQ, and that was kind of low, and he had the mental age of a 4-year-old. Can 4-year-olds go into court and understand the nature and object of the proceedings, go on the stand, and testify to defend themselves? No, I'm testifying in a case Friday with a 10-year-old. The The problem is with these cases is a lot of them are sex cases. So you have a 10-year-old that molests a 4-year-old. And now there's a new prosecutor in this one county who doesn't believe in not competent to stand trial. So I'll be driving a lot up there. Okay. So I guess you're getting the gist that a lot of it has to do with having a technical understanding of the law and applying psychological principles to it. I'll do a couple more. Guardianship is a person, an incapacitated person. You've got criteria. So I look at this question, I do the examination, and I try to answer A, B, or C. And the guardianship's always interesting because you have to look at all the medications, their dosage, and try to decide if any of these effects of the medication has on the person's behavior and are they incapacitated. I'm doing a lot more of these now. These are probate court. Sometimes, here's my pessimistic, jaded piece. Sometimes legislatures, state legislatures, make weird laws that either you can't apply. My greatest story was, I was talking about this at lunch, when I worked in the Iowa prison system and I went to school in Iowa City. I did my dissertation on sex offenders of children. And a legislator called me up and said, hey, I understand you work at the prison and that you're doing a research study on pedophiles. I said, yeah. He said, come talk to us because we're going to do a civil commitment law for sexual predators. This is in the mid-'90s. Where back then, there was the idea all these states were going to take and make a law where if you were a sex offender, they would keep you forever in prison. So I went and talked to a bunch of legislators, and they totally disregarded everything I had to say and made a law about civil commitment for sex offenders. And then they built a $3 million treatment facility. A few years later, I talked to someone I used to work with who was on the grounds where the facility was. And in 5 years, the way they wrote the law, only 2 people could sit in that facility. So they made this law, spent a bunch of money. So here's the newest Michigan one that's interesting. Sexually delinquent person. This came out in 2004, I believe. The term sexually delinquent person, when used in this act, shall mean any person whose sexual behavior is characterized by repetitive or compulsive acts which indicate a disregard of consequences of the recognized rights of others, or by use of force upon another person in attempting sexual relations of either heterosexual or homosexual. I don't know why that had to be in there. It must have been a Republican thing. Or by the commission of sex. I shouldn't say that, Republican country. Does it really matter if you attempt sexual relations by force if it's heterosexual or homosexual? Anyway, my first group of people I offended. Or by the commission of sexual aggression against children under the age of 16. What happens is they can find you under the Sexual Delinquent Person Act. They can go outside the normal parameters of sentencing, and they can sentence you to life in prison. So I got a bunch of these evaluations. They said, Jeff, they're going for sexual delinquent on this guy. He's been arrested 4 times for exposing himself. They want to put it. They're threatening to put him in prison forever. Well, the way that this is written, anyone who gets convicted of more than one sex crime falls within this. We would have talked about compulsive acts, repetitive or compulsive acts. So if you have a person that has, you've heard of flashers, right? They've been around forever. I don't do that. See, I'm not very good at that raincoat thing. But if you have a guy who flashes someone who has 3 counts of flashing, should they go to prison forever? I mean, it's sort of I guess a moral question, ethical question. Under this statute, they could. So, by the way, those guys are easy to treat, by the way. You don't need to spend $50,000 a year to put them away. And what they do is not good. And it can, I suppose, cause trauma in people. But they're easy to treat. So, Anyway, so I got a bunch of these. I must have got 10 of them within a couple of months. Well, every one of them met the criteria for this law. Every one of them, if they had more than one sex offense. A couple, and a lot of them were decent exposure people. So, or if you've had any acts of sexual aggression, more than one, against of a child under the age of 16. So some people may argue, hey, if you've molested and been convicted of molesting more than one kid, you should go away forever, okay? But this is the one where it really scooped up a lot of people. So I don't get those anymore. They don't try anymore. All right. You getting bored of all the legal mumbo jumbo? All right. Ba-bum. Profiling. Everybody wants to know about that, right? Here's the part where I disappoint everybody, because what happens in the real world versus on TV a lot of times is not the same. All right? Profiling has been around since the 50s. And it's used by people who call themselves behavioral scientists. That can be just about anybody. There are FBI agents who have bachelor's degrees in literature from Syracuse who become behavioral scientists. It's often based on actuarial data sets. What that means is insurance companies use actuarial data sets. Insurance companies years ago came up with this idea: if you drive a red car, you're more likely to get in an accident than if you drive a green car. So if you drive a red car, they upped your rates. I don't think they can do that anymore. Based on huge amounts of, it's based on statistics of groups. And that's how the FBI got into this business. So they did an actuarial data set on serial killers. Guess what? There aren't a lot of serial killers, well, that are caught, right? And if you've taken statistics yet, you'll understand that in order to get data that's really relevant, you need to have huge samples. The insurance company with the red car thing had, 1 million customer data set. Serial killers, 400. Okay. Played up in fiction. Sorry. This is in a lot of the movies where they do profiling. The media, I should put media plays up this too. The media really plays this up, okay? I've seen one job for a psychologist in 20 years that talked about profiling. So I talked about the FBI Behavioral Science Unit. Not that this is a bad idea, but the way it's used can be the problem. It's used to try to catch bad guys, cannot use in criminal proceedings. This is a big, big no-no, and judges go crazy when you get less than adequately trained psychologists who call themselves forensic psychologists who go in and try to say, I know this guy's guilty because of his profile. There may be a statute now about criminal profiling, and you can't use it in courts. But I'll do things like provide a conceptualization of this person, and they say, you can't do that, it's profiling. So not an empirically validated technique. That means it's not scientifically proven or sound that using profiling is accurate. Does it hurt when you're trying to catch guys? That's arguable, right? We have criminal justice majors here. Okay. Some criticism is that it doesn't work any better than regular good old detective work. Concern about false positives. You know this term, false positive? You're considered the type of person, and it's not true. Richard Jewell. Do you remember Richard Jewell? He was the security guard at the Atlanta Olympic Games. Remember the backpack that blew up? I think, did it kill some people? I know it injured a lot of people. If you all remember that, I can't remember what year that Olympics was. The Olympics in Atlanta. Richard Jewell spotted a backpack. He was a security guard, and it blew up. I think it killed a couple of people and injured a bunch of people. The FBI did a profile, and they said it's a white male between the ages of 35 and 40 who lives with his mother, is likely overweight, has a strong desire to be a law enforcement. So they started looking at Richard Jewell. I don't know how it got out to the press. So then the press was following Richard Jewell around. Do you remember this? He wasn't the guy. The guy who did it, and I might have the details wrong, was, I think it was a regular white guy, whatever that means, who I think, did he die up in the mountains of North Carolina or something? he was part of a, from what I know I'm just piecing this together and I'm wrong probably. I think he was part of a kind of a real strong fundamentalist Christian group. I mean, strong, like, trying to blow people up for God's purpose. Fanatical, how does that sound? Fanatical group. And didn't quite fit the profile that they came up with. So this is always a concern. They always say it's white males between 35 and 40. Who was the killer in Atlanta? The serial killer in Atlanta who was killing children 20 years ago. He ended up being an African-American guy who lived in the neighborhood, but they profiled him as a white guy between 30 and 35 who lives with his mother, has never had an adult, So that's a big concern. Okay. Questions about profiling? Hope I didn't crush dreams of wanting to be a criminal profiler. But it's something that's played up a lot in the media and in fiction, but as far as day-to-day work of a forensic psychologist, profiling, in fact, is really discouraged. Because imagine if you were the person that fit that profile all the time, like Richard Jewell, and then they're following you around. Risk assessment. Here's an interesting area. And I'll get through this stuff really quick here, because I want to move on to some more consultant type stuff. This is an interesting area. Risk to sexually offend, risk for violence, institutional, domestic, workplace, school, risk to reoffend. I had a bunch of referrals. By the way, none of these are based in statute. So what do you do as the forensic psychologist? You look at the literature on people who sexually offend, and you try to provide some opinion of the person's risk. I had a bunch of cases years ago of public school teachers, males, who ended up getting caught up in a sex sting in Riverside Park. They would, apparently that was a place where they could have anonymous sexual encounters with other men. And a lot of these guys were married, been working in the school systems for years and years, teacher of the year types. And all of a sudden they come on to a cop in the public bathroom. Well, then what happens is a lot of parents get up in arms because it hits the media and say, this guy's going to molest our kids. And the schools say, well, we're going to fire you, but they can't. So I got a bunch of cases where I had to provide an opinion about this person's risk to sexually offend against children. And most of them were not a risk to children because they were having sex with other men in public bathrooms. In fact, here's your little statistic. If you are a homosexual male, statistically, you're less likely to molest a child than a heterosexual male. Isn't that interesting? So it kind of blows the stereotype away that people may hold. So I had a bunch of those cases. Risk for violence, institutional. When I get back here, don't call the cops. I'm coming back to GRCC tomorrow with a gun, and I'm going to do a Virginia Tech thing. Actual case I had from this campus. The police, the institution says this person is not allowed back on campus. Are they a risk for violence against others? Bomb threats. I had a bomb threat guy at a GRCC that I had to evaluate for the courts. Workplace, right? Going postal, is that the term you hear now? Right? Is that still a term that people use anymore, right? Because of the postal workers who would go in and shoot up the place and kill people. So I'll get that. Someone will make a threat, and the employer takes it very serious. Okay. Risk to reoffend. These are a lot of times folks that they're trying to release from prison or jail, and you have to assess their risk. All right. I'm going to talk very, very briefly. Is this all right for you guys? Are you learning some things? Are you bored? If you're bored, tell me. Okay. I'm going to talk just really briefly about family law. I hope no one in this room I've evaluated, unless I said good things about you. I'll get referrals for divorce and custody evaluations. two people are getting divorced, or they've been divorced and now they're fighting over custody of the kids. Those aren't pretty. Custody evaluation, you usually interview mom, dad, all the kids. And yes, you do apply a statute, Michigan Child Custody Act. These are the 12 factors that the court considers in deciding how to do custody with kids. So a psychologist comes in and weighs in an opinion on all of these. Where's the one I like? The moral fitness of the parents involved. That's a cool one. Here's the one where the psychologist really puts a lot of work into the mental and physical health of the parties involved. More often, I'll do what's called ability to parent evaluations or capacity to parent. Does this person have any mental illness, any problems, or any active substance abuse problems? And does this person have an adequate and appropriate understanding of child development and parenting? And if there are any deficits or problems outlined above, how does it affect his or her ability to parent? Nasty divorces, maybe some of you have been into it. They get nasty and mom says dad's crazy, dad says mom's crazy. Judge will say, get this figured out. We do these, turns out they're both okay. They're just in a bad situation and they're just acting nasty to each other. Well, then when side A brings it up again, the judge says, that's it, we covered this. So a lot of the judges like these. I like doing these too. I don't like these. I don't like psychologists trying to weigh in on these type of, these are expensive to do too. So I'll do a lot of these. These will also get used in child neglect and abuse cases. If someone's been accused of abusing their child, they'll want to know about their ability to parent. And if this comes back bad, a lot of times they'll try to terminate a parent's rights. The court will. All right, consultant. I talked a little bit about consultant role. Jury selection. That's an interesting area. Occupation of jury consultant versus trial consultant. A jury consultant helps you pick the jury. This came around in the 1970s and a lot of social psychologists. By the way, if you end up going to grad school in psychology, go find the social psychology students. They're always the coolest students. You know what I'm saying? They like to party. They're a lot of fun, social psychologists. They really are. This gained a lot of media attention. William Kennedy Smith, remember, they hired one, and OJ, right? Oh, here we go again. There are few, if any, convincing demonstrations that scientific jury selection is more effective than routine jury selection. Can you buy a jury? Maybe. Probably not. A lot of folks make money doing this. It got a lot of media attention. You talk to any attorney who's selected juries, they said you can just never predict what you can think of all these things. I've been hired to interview witnesses and look at the jury questionnaires. And interview potential jurors, be involved in that. You just never know. There's really no method. Although I think the OJ trial was very interesting because it's more my little theory. Johnny Cochran was able to help, in my opinion, the juries have an emotional response to an issue, racism. And there's been an argument they voted on that rather than the evidence. I don't know if OJ did it or not, but interesting idea. A couple of other things you'll do as a forensic psychologist: specialized expert witness. I'll testify on a lot of the things already presented, but I'll testify on things like bonding and attachment to children. Do we want this child who's 2 to do a 50-50 custody split with mom in Arizona and dad in Michigan? How's that going to affect bonding and attachment? Some other false allegations of sexual abuse. That's an interesting one. I testified in an appeals case. Were these allegations of sexual abuse? You look at the literature, by the way. The research literature. What's involved in false allegations of sexual abuse? Did this particular scenario show a lot of those similar characteristics? And then the judge or jury can decide. Forensic record review. This is the one I really like doing. You get to scrutinize people's work. So a therapist comes along and tries to do forensic psychology stuff with no training. They go into court and they muddy the waters, or they come up with conclusions that are just not based in science. There's a lot of that out there. and I will review the records and testify or help the attorneys get the witness thrown out or how to cross-examine. And then trial prep, helping the attorney strategize, preparation for cross-examination of expert witnesses. Okay. There are a lot of other things involved in forensic psychology, right? Let's go back around the horn here. I taught a whole course on this one time, by the way. Let me tell you quickly how I got involved in this. I was working I was a grad student at the University of Iowa, and my advisor, John, said, Jeff, I think you should go and work at the prison for a semester. I said, why would I want to do that, John? There's just something about you that I think you'd do well in that environment. I don't know what that means, but I went there and I is this a weird term? Sort of fell in love with how fascinating it is about why people mistreat each other. And I stayed there 3 years, interned there, went as a prison psychologist for 7 years, and now came into private practice, and I'm still making a living off of people mistreating each other. To be honest with you, it never gets boring. That's for sure. It's never boring. If you look at how broad the field is, there's all kinds of different stuff. I've done most of these, but every once in a while, a new one will come up. The civil litigation one is pretty interesting when you're trying to sue other people and talk about emotional distress and damage. I had a big Jeffrey Feiger case. You guys know him? A psychologist with the Michigan Department of Corrections was being sued by Jeffrey Feiger because of an inmate death. So I had to evaluate his work and provide an affidavit, which is a written opinion that they can use as evidence in court about what the psychologist did. So it's a rapidly expanding field. My little criticism is there's a lot of people that try to do this work and they haven't had adequate training, and they end up causing a lot of problems, particularly when we get into the family law issues or fitness to carry a firearm. I won't do these anymore. The law is just too weird, and the people who end up coming, this is awful to say, the people that the court feels need to have a psychological evaluation to carry a firearm probably shouldn't be carrying a firearm, because you usually need to have reasons for that. The court has to have reasons for that. So I don't even do those anymore. They're just not worth it. I don't know of anybody in town that's doing them now. So, all right. I went 1 hour and 5 minutes. Or no, what did I go? Almost 45 minutes. I ran through everything because I want to just open it up for questions. Questions about anything. Questions about all of this. Questions about how much do you drink, Jeff, after dealing with these people every day?
Jeff, could you share the path? If somebody wanted to become a forensic psychologist, that was your question.
Yeah.
What would it look like?
Hang on just a second.
Yeah.
Because we're recording this for our consumption later, we need to make sure that our questions are asked into the microphone so that the audio can be picked up on the tape. So it'll take a little bit longer, but what we'll be doing is shuttling the microphone around. You'll all get an opportunity to ask your questions.
Well, Mike, you should be running up and down the thing like
That's
Phil Donahue used to do. Yeah.
Like any of these people that would go down here.
The career path for forensic psychologists. First of all, you're going to need to go to graduate school. Some areas in forensic psychology you can do quite well with a master's degree. Correctional psychology, you can go work in prisons. Typically, if you're going to be providing expert testimony, which has to do with a lot of these, most of the time you'd want to look at getting a PhD or a PsyD, a doctorate in psychology. You can do it with a master's, but you'll get a lot more flack from attorneys. There are some folks in town with master's degrees that testify in court and do a good job in this. They've had really good training. So you've got the academic training. You need to have a license, right? You probably need to be a psychologist rather than a social worker, because psychologists understand psychological testing. A lot of other fields like licensed professional counselor and social workers really don't get training in testing, because for a lot of these you have to do psychological testing. And then what you need to do is, if you can get an internship, that's the key, because you'll get in a structured training program. Some people retool. They go and they become therapists at a community college counseling center and say, I want to be a forensic psychology. So they end up taking they read a lot of books, take sanctioned coursework through American Psychological Association or some of the forensic outfits, and then they're able to get competent in these. But if you're going to go that route, you probably need to have some peer supervision by someone who does this work and has had specific training in it. So it's quite a process. You know, a PhD is going to take you altogether 10 years. But it can be done. There's a lot of need for people to do this work in a good, competent way. Good question.
What we're gonna do is you can ask your question, and then Frank, Dr. Connor, is going to repeat it, so we don't have to keep running the microphone back and forth.
So we've got one here.
Okay.
What's your question?
When you were talking about juvenile competence, and I'm just curious, do you determine if they're competent to stand trial, if they're competent to know the law, and then, like, when they get older, is there something where they say, okay, now they're older, we can...
So the question is around juvenile competence. When you were evaluating it, what are you looking at?
Great question. Juvenile competence is a funny one. Like I said, there's no statute in Michigan and most states about juvenile competence. So the adult statutes say mental disease or defect. In the case law, that's usually defined as a serious mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, stuff like that, or mental retardation. So what if you get a 10-year-old who's not mentally retarded and they don't have mental illness, but they're 10 or they're 7? One thing that the case law allows you to do is to talk about emotional maturity, frustration tolerance as part of the developmental age of the child. 8-year-olds can be pushed around by adults on the stand. The case I think I'm going to testify in, I got another case I'm going to testify in with this prosecutor who doesn't like my work, is can a 9-year-old have the emotional maturity to sit in court and be on the stand for cross-examination? Not many of them, okay? So with juvenile competency, I get a little more leeway. That can be dangerous, so you sort of need to know what you're doing. So juvenile competency, those are the things I look at. Competent to stand trial or competent to understand the law. Competent to stand trial is the big part. Understanding the law is a piece of it. Understanding the law, being able to behave appropriately in the courtroom. If you have a kid who's 9 and has ADHD and is not on any medications, is he paying attention? Right? So those are other things you look at. So the juvenile, you get a little bit more leeway, and the judges tend to let that in, and the case law supports it too. But great question.
Earlier you said that Gacy had killed 33 people and the defense team was unsuccessful in the sentencing.
Right.
How is killing 33 people not considered the same?
Great question.
So the question is, with John Wayne Gacy, how is killing 33 people not insane?
Okay. Did John Wayne... Now, see, you're getting into an area which is really fascinating for what a forensic psychologist has to do. You go, Jeff, how can you talk to people about this stuff all day and it doesn't drive you batty? Because my job's very specific. What he did was reprehensible. I mean, I've talked to people who've killed their own children in all kinds of bad ways I won't share with you. But all I have to answer, did John Wayne Gacy appreciate the nature and quality or the wrongfulness of his acts? Okay? And was there a mental disease or was he able to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law? I don't know a lot of specifics about the Gacy case, but here's what I do know that I can tell you. He planned these, okay? He tried to cover them up. He hid the bodies. When they asked him about it, he said, I didn't do that, okay? So you argue he understood the nature and quality of the wrongfulness of his acts, regardless of how reprehensible they were. He's a sociopath. I could talk about sociopaths. Now, some people would say, did he have this urge or this compulsion to rape and kill children that he couldn't control? That's a high hurdle to get over. You have to attach it to a mental illness. So what mental illness results in a symptom where you have to rape and kill children. There is none. So you have to attach everything to a symptom of a mental disease or defect. Case law says a mental illness or mental retardation. Sociopath. I'll tell you, that's what a lot of serial killers are. Sociopaths do not have a connection to people like most of us do. I heard a great example. For a sociopath to punch you in the face would be like punching a board. And here I'll get gross. How can sociopaths cut people up? Cut people up. Hey, have you ever cut a chicken breast in half? Did you cut your sandwich in half today? That's the same thing for a sociopath. They don't have that connection. Cutting a person's head off, is like cutting a piece of chicken in half. There's no connection. Sociopath is not a diagnosis. If it became a diagnosis, what would that do to insanity defenses for serial killers? So you have to attach it to a symptom of a mental illness. So regardless of how awful the thing is they did. I know you're going, this person must be crazy to do something like that. Well, is it a diagnosable mental illness? And I tell you, anytime that someone plans it and tries to cover it up, they've kind of taken this off the table most of the time. Unless they're planning it and covering it up is based on a delusion, you know. Did I answer your question? Okay.
For temporary insanity, what about when a guy comes home or a woman comes home, finds their significant other having an affair and attacks that person?
Great.
So temporary, like an active passion, where you come home, you find your spouse in bed with somebody else, and you kill them both.
I don't have that statute in front of me. Guess what? Active passion is there's an actual law about an active passion. Now, in the old days, I'll talk very briefly, because you know I'm a PhD, I talk more. I like to hear myself talk.
Why are you laughing?
Insanity and lack of criminal responsibility became much more well-defined in the early 1980s. For example, before the early 80s, in a lot of states, the burden of proof for insanity was on the prosecution. What that means is the prosecution had to prove you're sane. They lost a lot of cases. The Harvey Milk Twinkie defense. They couldn't prove the guy was sane. The burden of proof shifted in most states, and it's on all states now, shifted onto the defense. So the defense has to prove the person was insane. An active passion, which is you walk in on your spouse and they're in bed with someone else and you flip out. I blacked out. I snapped. Isn't there one of these shows called Snapped? That used to work in the older insanity laws. They got rid of that, but it's still around in Michigan. You can only use it in sentencing now. So I walk in on my wife and kill the guy that she's sleeping with. Active passion. All right, am I criminally responsible? Well, did I know the nature and consequences of my actions? Yeah, I tried to bury him in the backyard. Could I conform my conduct to requirements of the law? Well, was there a mental illness that was involved in my snapping? Probably not a symptom of a mental illness. There's not, like finding your spouse in bed with somebody else, rage syndrome. That doesn't exist, right? But what will happen is I cut a deal. And I say, okay, I'm guilty. Sentence me, judge. And the judge and the attorney sends you to a forensic psychologist. And I pull up the idea of active passion and evaluate the person to see if it was based on an active passion. So I say it was. The person had been cheated on by 6 people in the past. They had a little bit of depression. They had low self-esteem. And all of this happened, and it was an impulse that they freaked out and they did something out of character. That's a thing they like. Then it goes to the judge, and then the judge decides. And the judge said, you know what? That happened to me too. And time served. Or, you know what? I'm not buying it. You're getting 30 to life. So it really falls into the judge's lap. It's not used very often anymore. But it used to be part of the old insanity stuff. It's a great question, though. Good stuff.
I have a question about when you were talking about parents
So the question is around parental evaluation, foster care, taking a child out of their biological home.
Yeah, boy, and I do quite a bit of work in that field. What will happen is, I'll give you a scenario, is a child gets put into foster care, and they're in foster care, and the parent has, say, a substance abuse problem and a little bit of depression. So the child, within a year, the court has to make a decision whether to allow the child to go back or terminate the rights of a parent. So the parent typically has a year to shape up. They work a treatment plan with the social service agency. There will be requirements like you can't use drugs or alcohol if that's one of your problems. You need to get in therapy and get medication for depression. So then after a year, if they haven't got their act together, oftentimes the prosecutor moves towards terminating the rights. And what that allows is now that child, if they are successful, they hold a trial, if they're successful in terminating the rights, they'll bring me in to testify. If they're successful in terminating rights, then that child's eligible for adoption. Now, yeah, funding in the foster care system has really affected things. I think we're seeing less work coming from social service agencies in the court with this now. We used to see a lot of people, but there's just not the money, so we're getting more of the just really severe cases. Or the judges like our work a lot. There's about 4 or 5 of us in our firm who do this. The judges really depend on it because when you go in and you testify, as an expert, yeah, the person's got a cocaine abuse program, this is a problem, this is what they need to do to straighten up, this is what they need to do treatment. Yeah, they got some depression, they need to do this. Or they got a personality disorder. It's not looking so good, if you know about personality disorders. Well then, if the judge moves to terminate rights and it comes back on an appeal, they can say, look at the psychologist said this. So the judges, they scramble a lot of times to find, social service agencies, I think, scramble to find money to pay us to do these. We do them at a discounted rate because a lot of people in my practice are old hippies. They think that's important. So I'm an 80s kid, so I just care about me, right? And then, so they struggle to find the funding, but the judges really rely on these because you don't want to do it incomplete and then it comes back in appeal and the kid's already been adopted by another family and you got to pull out. It's a real mess. So, good question.
When you're determining an individual's risk to reoffend, what factors do you account for?
So the question is around how do you determine the risk to reoffend?
It depends on what you're trying to answer. Sexually reoffend? What we do is there's a lot of great research, particularly the Canadians. The Canadians are miles ahead of us on all of this stuff. The Canadians did a big study of 10,000 sex offenders, and they made a bunch of variables drop out, actuarial variables. Your age, how does that, there's rating systems you can do. You can actually come up with an equation that can fit into high, low risk. So you've got a bunch of factors, and there's a couple of different rating scales that I like. And you check. And if they have this number of factors, they're associated in the normative sample. We're getting into psych testing. The normative sample with folks who have reoffended. Violence risk. You look at, there are things called static variables, unchanging variables. You never finish type. The one I like with violence is a history of behavioral problems in elementary school. That's been associated in the research with potential for violence. So those are static. There's a lot more work that's being done now on dynamic or changing variables. That's a tough one. Your level of depression, how does that impact? A lot of times for the forensic psychologist, it's a bit of a judgment call. You'll get a bunch of factors. The one scale I use for the sexual offending risk, they got a section at the end. Any other pertinent variables? Well, I know from my own research, my own experience, there are certain things that put you at higher risk to sexually offend. So I might plug those in. So that stuff gets slippery because there's not a statute to base it on, so you got to go to the research. Good question, though. By the way, really quick, the Canadians, they do everything on this. If you go to prison in Canada, the psychologist that does your intake has your elementary school records in front of them. Can you imagine that? To be in Canada, if you're going to be sentenced on a violent or sex crime, you go see a forensic psychologist, and they determine what would be, what do they say, in the best interest of the Canadian citizens. So basically, if you're low risk to reoffend, they put you on community probation. If you're high risk to reoffend, they put you away for a long time. They'll base their sentencing decisions on that. We don't do that here, at least in Michigan, we don't. So you get some really weird sentences. I'll tell you this quick story. It involves sex, so everybody will listen. And weird stuff. And this is all in the court record. I saw a guy one time that 16-year-old boy was at his house, and he took a picture of the 16-year-old boy's butt with a camera phone. By the way, camera phones made me a lot of money because of everybody taking pictures of. And he also had sex with the kid too. But it wasn't illegal. He was in his 50s. Oh, he's not here. It wasn't illegal for him to have sex with the 16-year-old boy because 16 is a legal age of consent. But it was illegal to take a picture of his naked butt. So then the judge sentenced the guy to every weekend in prison for 3 years, or every weekend in jail for 3 years. It's really weird. So the Canadians, they have a lot of structure set on this. Or we don't have, yeah, that was one of the weirdest sentences I've ever seen. Apparently you only take pictures of 16-year-old boys' butts on weekends or something. I don't know. Hope no one's related to that judge that did that sentence. But like I said, it doesn't get boring. Other questions? Yeah.
How does forensic psychology and whole carry a firearm work with the Bill of Rights and the right for everyone to carry a firearm?
Well, that's a great big question.
So the constitutional question around how does the forensic psychology relating to fitness to carry a firearm relate to constitutional right to carry
Okay.
or not carry a firearm?
Great question. Michigan has a very specific statute and criteria about what you need to be or in order to carry a firearm. The forensic psychologist pulls that statute out and looks at it. And I don't remember the criteria off the top of my head, but they're sort of weird. And you have to look through and apply the statute to the psychology of the person. How that goes to Bill of Rights, I think the issue would be, some people would argue, well, based on the Bill of Rights, you can't design these requirements. That would probably be a Bill of Rights advocate's idea, that it's a fundamental right and you can't put restrictions on that right. So you're kind of getting into a legal argument. But the forensic psychology just gets the statute and uses that as a template. Did I answer your question? Yeah, okay.
There's a question here.
I've been doing a lot of research lately, and I've run across a defense called homosexual panic. Have you ever run into that?
I've never heard about it, but tell me about it.
It's where somebody who's committed a violent act against a homosexual can assert it because they aren't in the right state of mind. So it's basically like temporary insanity.
You know what? I have heard a little bit about. Where is that happening?
It was used in the case of Matthew Shepard in
Oh.
1999.
That's right. Yeah, I don't know a lot about that case, but I don't think that's. Boy, that's an interesting one. So they're trying to use it as sort of a temporary insanity. Well, homosexual panic is not a diagnosable mental illness, right? It's not a. Is it a mental disease or defect? Well, not based on what the case law says. So I don't know how that could go anywhere. Did it work?
From the article that I read, it said that it didn't like completely get them off, but it like, lowered their sentence. At least in the case of Matthew Shepard, and
Okay.
listed a couple other cases as well.
It lowered their sentence, so the judge considered that. Wow. Wow. You know, you wonder if those cases come back on appeals. If, for example, there are certain groups who could fund attorneys to say that that was an unjust sentence and the person should get more. But yeah, I don't think they could use it for insanity or criminal responsibility because it's not a diagnosable mental illness. Good question. Thanks for educating me. Yeah, right here.
I have a question about something I saw in a news article or something that apparently there's a lot of like adolescents, 13 teenagers that are sending nude pictures of each other
Yeah.
over phones. I was wondering how the courts are treating that as like technically child porn, but at the same time, in their state of mind, it's normal for them.
That's a great question.
So the question is around sexting, the idea of 13-year-olds taking graphic sexual images of each other and sending it via cell phones.
Yeah, or, the high school party, breaking in the door and taking a picture of somebody having sex and send it to everybody, and it's on everybody's Facebook or videos and stuff. How are the courts handling it? In my experience, they're handling it in all kinds of different ways. I had a couple of cases, and the Michigan laws about sex abuse are weird. For example, and I was in Iowa, it was very strongly written in the law that if two people have sex and they're both under the legal age of consent, 16, there needs to be a 5-year age span before you can prosecute on a sex crime. We don't have that standard set in stone in Michigan. So what I'm finding in these cases with the cell phone images, I've had a case where they tried to charge a CSC, but it didn't really go anywhere. I do know that there's a lot of arguing and appeals cases about that. So sort of the jury's still out in the way the courts are handling that. In my experience dealing with, I've probably had about 4 or 5 of those cases. What ends up happening is I'll do an evaluation of the kid who sent it. And it really doesn't say much. And then they end up settling it. Most of the time in a non-sexual offense, like a disorderly conduct. I've only had about 4 or 5 experiences of that. But I know that that's one that's being challenged a lot in courts. I had a bunch of those a couple years ago. I haven't had any lately. So the jury's still out. Yeah, with technology coming online, whoa. I mean, it's really thrown a lot of things upside down, You get this, did this kid do this because of, criminal intent. I'll talk about that for about 1 minute. Criminal intent, your ability to form intent to do a criminal act. We used to have a thing in Michigan law called diminished capacity, which says because of a symptom of mental illness, your ability to form intent, in other words, you want to do a bad thing, was diminished. They got rid of this in 1998, out the window. What I do in my juvenile cases is I talk about a thing called culpability, which fits in with this. If a child's culpable, that means it was more of a character-driven behavior, and it wasn't based on or influenced by a symptom of mental illness. Give me an example. Kid standing in line at Meijer with his mom, 13-year-old, ADHD. It's the summer weekend, so he's not taking his medication. He reaches out and grabs a girl's butt in line. I shouldn't say girl. She was an adult woman. The adult woman files sexual assault charges against the 13-year-old and says, I want that kid prosecuted. Well, so was the kid criminally responsible was the question I had. Well, he knew it was the wrong thing to do. But one of the hallmark symptoms of ADHD is impulsivity. And he was very impulsive and not on his medications. So I basically wrote about his culpability. Was this really a bad kid who was doing something, forming criminal intent? I want to do something bad. Or was this a kid who just had an urge, had ADHD off his medication, and grabbed her? So we did kind of a backdoor diminished capacity. Because do you want your 13-year-old ADHD who grabbed someone's butt in the line at Meijer to be on this sexual offender registry and probably not be able to, get a job someday? So, hope I answered your question. Yeah.
She knew this guy, he was walking the store with his son, and his son had ADHD again, and was grabbing things off the shelves, making a mess, wouldn't know what they were grabbing by the arm, without even getting any groceries to walk out of the store. Well, a bystander saw this, took down his license plate number, went to court, and he was on the sex offender list, or on the radar for
So the question is around prosecuting an adult for grabbing his son's arm and taking him out of the store.
Well, I think the one thing you're talking about, too, is there's a registry of people who've been substantiated with doing child abuse. There's a registry. There's a sex offender registry. We all know about that. There's also a registry with the police about people who've been... So the idea is, I've had cases like that, actually, where the person gets on the registry. They have to be substantiated through Child Protective Services, typically. Child Protective Services does an assessment and said, yes, you did abuse. Boom, you're on the registry. Child Protective Services is an interesting area. The way the laws apply with Child Protective Services are a bit different than they do with a lot of other things. So a Child Protective Services worker can go through the process, put you on the registry as someone who's been substantiated of abuse. And that could affect you, maybe in some ways. I see it in divorces a lot. So, yeah, I mean, believe me, Child Protective Services send me a lot of work. They do great work. But the way the law applies to them is a little different than a lot of other mechanisms there in society. So, hope I answered your question or addressed it. Yeah.
If you're evaluating a person that committed a crime, like say 3 months ago or something like that, what do you do to figure out where they were at when they committed the crime?
So the question is, how do you go back and recreate the state the person was in months after the crime was committed?
Great question. That's one of the most difficult things in doing criminal responsibility evaluations. So what you have to do is you have to find out, okay, what day was it? May 15th. All right, do you remember that day? Yeah. I've got the police report in front of me. That's a big key. I need to have the police report. And then I'll say things, all right, well, tell me what happened. What did they say happened? What really happened? Back me out. What were you doing before that? Well, I was riding my bike. Okay, well, what about that morning? Did anything happen that morning? Yeah, my sister called and said that she was going to bring the kids over. Okay, so what you have to do is you have to create or get an assessment of the person's mental state prior to the alleged crime, during the alleged crime, and after the alleged crime. In a lot of cases, the police report can help you a lot if the police have been on scene immediately after the crime, because the police will make statements about the person's presentation. So you really have to walk the person back, starting with the police report, and try to get an idea what happened that day. Hear about the truck driver who was, a few years ago, was picking up male prostitutes on Division and drugging them and gluing their eyes shut with super glue. Do you remember that case? It didn't get as much media attention as you would think. Anyway, I saw that guy. And we created, when his runs, where his runs were, what he did that day, when he went cruising, and all of that kind of stuff. So you start with the police report and you kind of work both ways out. That's a tough thing to do. It really is. Particularly if the person was, forgive me for this phrase, so out of their mind they didn't even know what day it was. But typically you'll have records of that. Sometimes you don't. So it's a bit of a judgment call. If you can't make this determination, then you have to say they were likely criminally responsible. You have to basically prove that they weren't. And you, as a forensic psychologist, not as a prosecutor.
We're limited to a couple more questions. So.
Come on over here.
How is it that you go to do this without looking policy?
So the question is, how do you go and have the person relive the day without introducing false memories?
Great question. Do I have false memories up here? False confession, that's not great. Great question. Okay, what that really boils down to, there's a bunch of the daycare cases where they find out that these therapists and these police that were interviewing kids were implanting ideas and the kids were accepting them as their own. So one thing I have to do, and I had a lot of training on this when I went through my training, is that when I do a forensic interview, I have to be very conscious that I don't provide the person details that I just speculate. What I will do is I'll have the police report, and I'll say, well, the police report says that you were at your brother's house and you ordered a pizza. Okay, I've got that, right? You know, what happened before that? What did you get on the pizza? Okay, but I can't speculate verbally about what could have happened or what would not have happened. So a lot of times the story about what happened that day, I won't have the whole story. Okay, but you make a great point. You're talking about a thing called leading questions. And if you get trained in forensic interview, you learn how to not do that. Because, yeah, you can implant ideas into people, particularly if they're in a compromised mental state at that time. So sometimes my reports will read, the person really didn't know what they did beforehand. I don't say what I thought they did. But great question, though. That's an excellent question.
One last question. Or not?
How do you, I see you have various education. How do you set yourself apart from other graduates so that you're available for some of the specialized cases and things you've done?
So how do you set yourself apart as a psychologist, as a forensic psychologist?
Well, part of it is doing talks like this. By the way, if you ever have questions for me, that's all my stuff if you want to email me. How to set yourself apart? Well, part of it is I was very fortunate to have probably some of the best training in the world. So when you throw out that forensic Bureau of Prison thing, people pay attention to that. The other thing is doing talks like this. I go and I talk to Michigan Bar Association. Here, I'll talk to various places. Word of mouth helps a lot. Internet. Not internet, just our website, but I'll get cited in Court of Appeals cases. I've had referrals where people will say, an attorney will say, we ran a lit search and your name came up in a Court of Appeals case, blah, blah, blah. Do you do this kind of work? So word of mouth, I've been at it now 8 years. And my name gets passed around to different people. I don't really publish much. I do, I've written a few articles here and there, like the Bar Association journals and stuff like that. But mostly it just becomes word of mouth and reputation and doing talks like this. I saw you do a talk, like when one of you guys sent me a referral in 3 years. I saw you at Grand Rapids Community College. And so that's kind of how you set yourself apart.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
Dr. Kalashevsky.